Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. Okay, well, it's 10 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Lisa Hegarty. I'm with the Litchfield Park Historical Society, and we're so glad that you could be here today, and I want to welcome all of you who are joining us through Zoom, and we certainly thank the church for all their help in helping us make this come together today. So, before we get started, I just want to do a little housekeeping for our Zoomers. We are going to keep you muted as you enter the Zoom presentation. For those of you watching on Zoom, you can choose which view you have. You can have just speaker view, so you may kind of look around and see what you want to click on for that. Also, we will allow people to ask questions at the end of the presentation. And so for those of you on Zoom, if you're not familiar, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little speech bubble, and it says chat. Oops. And what you'll want to do is click on that, and you'll have a window that comes up on the right. And on the very bottom where you see that orange circle is where you can type your message or your question. And once you hit enter on your keyboard, your question appears in sort of this queue. So at the end of the presentation, we'll have all your questions listed up there, and we can work through them if you have any questions as they come up. Okay? All right, so this talk today is connected to an exhibit that we have up on at the museum currently on the Spanish flu. And so to start us off, I'd kind of like to start off with a poem from the time. The flu. When your back is broke and your eyes are blurred and your shin bones knock and your tongue is furred and your tonsils squeak and your hair gets dry and you're doggone sure that you're going to die, and you're scared you won't and afraid you will, just drag to bed and have your chill and pray the Lord to see you through, for you've got the flu, you've got the flu. When your toes curl up and your belt gets flat and you're twice as mean as a Thomas cat and all your food tastes like a hard-boiled curse and life seems a black and dismal hearse, when your lattice aches and your head's abuzz and nothing is as it ever was, here are my sad regrets to you, for you've got the flu, you've got the flu. What is it like, this Spanish flu? Ask me, brother, I've been through. It is a misery out of despair. It pulls your teeth and curls your hair. It thins your blood and brays your bones and fills your craw with moans and groans. And sometime, maybe, you'll get well. Some call it flu. I call it hell. So, let me see if I can get the poem. There it is. This poem appeared in the Chicago Tribune during the pandemic, and it was reprinted in newspapers all around the country. And when I first came across it, I just thought it was such a curious thing. You know, it seemed so odd. And it turns out there were lots of poems, a lot of humorous poems about the flu, cartoons about the flu while it was going on. And it was just kind of puzzling to me. You had this devastating, lethal disease, and yet people were joking about it. But now that we're dealing with COVID, we've probably seen some humor dealing with that, and it becomes a little more understandable. Maybe it's a way to process, a way to kind of get through the situation. So sifting through online images, poems, and you find things like this. Oops. And I'm thinking many of you already are interested in the flu and have seen a lot of comparisons in the media, and you've come across images like these. But for me, it was these images tucked away in a back corner of one of our galleries at the museum, which sparked an interest in creating an exhibit on the influenza pandemic of 1918. And I was fascinated by the fact that here in our local geography, our local landscape, we have, tangible parts of that landscape that have a direct link to, this major global event. And so that was kind of the jumping off point for me. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the background of the flu, kind of characterize the time so you can get a sense of what it was like. And then kind of work my way into certain communities around Arizona, and then gradually work our way in all the way to Litchfield Park. So, we know that it was a huge, far-reaching event. It touched everyone's lives. There wasn't any part of the world that was spared. It lasted from March of 1918 until the summer of 1919, and some researchers say even on into June of 1920. The virus is estimated to have killed, conservatively, 50 million people, maybe up to 100 million people. And so for context, World War I.
They're saying they can't hear you. Can you speak up?
Okay.
And then the screen, they're having a hard time. Maybe the lights could be
Okay.
down some.
Alberto, can the lights be adjusted so that the screen's a little more visible? Okay, is that better with the sound? How's that? Okay. Well, hopefully those adjustments help everyone see and hear a little bit better. So, conservative estimates, there were 50 million deaths from the flu. And for context, in World War I, we were talking about 18 million deaths. And for World War II, it was 60 million deaths. So, obviously, a very devastating event. In the US, there were 675,000 deaths, and about a fourth of the US population became infected. And a third of the world's population became infected. Something else about this event. Travel and mobility that were heightened due to World War I had everything to do with the spread of this disease. You had army camps that were training thousands of soldiers, and then they would move on to another camp and continue their training and move on to other locations. And so the flu was able to spread quite easily that way. Then they loaded onto ships and crossed the ocean to go fight in trenches, which were also, the perfect conditions for spreading the disease. And in fact, more US soldiers died from the 1918 influenza epidemic than were killed in battle during the war. You probably heard that that it was most devastating to the young and healthy, which was very surprising and shocking. Young children under the age of 5 were vulnerable. Adults over 65 were also vulnerable. But almost half the deaths worldwide were adults in their 20s and 30s. The pandemic came in waves, and it's that second wave in the fall of 1918 that was the most deadly. So it was also probably pretty terrifying because it was highly infectious, and it presented a myriad of symptoms, and it often puzzled and frightened people. Doctors often misdiagnosed it at first. Some diagnosed it as typhoid or cholera. And there were extreme, severe symptoms that are thought to have been brought about by an overreaction of the immune system. So you had, lungs filling with fluid. People often develop pneumonia after developing the flu, and those were often the causes of death. Just like today, there was a race to create a vaccine during the flu pandemic. There was no successful flu vaccine until the 1930s, the early 1930s, because the virus was, they were just becoming familiar with the concept of a virus being out there, and they didn't have the tools to detect viruses yet. Doctors were reaching for all kinds of treatment. Here we have an image of a military doctor administering like an antiseptic spray in the hopes that that would prevent the flu. But they tried aspirin, they tried quinine, they tried enemas, they tried bloodletting, anything they could think of. And in fact, there's a study that scholars believe that actually aspirin, toxic levels of aspirin may have been prescribed and been responsible for a certain number of deaths. And you're probably aware that the disease was so out of hand at certain points that some communities had trouble burying the dead, that hospitals were overflowing. But most people were left to fight that disease at home, and they were relying on home remedies. Here, again, a gargle is being given to soldiers, but we have people trying things like hanging mothballs around their necks, or we have a piece of an oral history from a family in Lakeside, Arizona, whose mother prepared onions constantly. Was, making stews and soups and frying them and just feeding them tons of onions, and to their mind, that helped them get through the flu. So people were just relying on whatever they could. You also had businesses capitalizing on the flu, which is kind of familiar today. Here we have a Lysol ad. I just heard an ad for Lysol the other day in connection with COVID. Keep your family safe and clean and all that kind of thing. And you also had certain products that sold out. In this case, it was Vicks VapoRub. They couldn't keep up the production because everybody was buying it up. So it's also interesting to take a close look at what was going on through newspapers, and what you tend to see is a lot of contradictions. There was a tendency to minimize the crisis at first. You have headlines like these saying it's nothing but, the good old flu, we've been here before, we'll stay healthy, we'll get through it. But at the same time, you might turn the page in your newspaper and be reading about people who have the flu in your neighborhood. That middle image there with all the orange circles on the page of the newspaper, those represent stories pertaining to individuals who are either battling the flu, recovering from the flu, or have just died from the flu. And people are named. It's not an anonymous thing. So while you have that, you have kind of like this confusion in information, and that of course leads to all kinds of misconceptions, misinformation, and in some cases, conspiracy theories. People believed at one point that it could be germ warfare brought over on German U-boats. And the US government actually investigated that to see if there's any truth to it. Another kind of extreme example is that in Phoenix, in early December, there was a rumor circulating that dogs carried the flu. And people so readily believed it or were convinced of it that the police were killing dogs in the street. People were willing to have their own pets killed or to kill their own dogs. So great was the fear. So you also have here headlines like this: influenza to be followed by the end of the world. And they're citing a leader of a religious sect in Chicago who says that the epidemic of influenza is only the first chapter in a book of sorrows, the climax of which will be the destruction of the planet. And we also have people believing that emotions could influence whether you would get sick or not. So when the armistice came around, people thought, well, everybody's going to be happier now. The war's over. We have less of that added stress. And, health officials actually expected flu cases to go down because of that. But that wasn't the case. You also saw pretty standard health advice printed in the newspapers. So you had kind of like this mix of information. Add to that that during the war, any of the countries that were involved in the war were suppressing the news of the flu, especially at first, for the sake of morale for the country, or not to give anything away to the enemy. And so it became known as the Spanish flu because the Spanish press reported on it freely because they were neutral and not involved in the conflict. So there you have kind of like a picture of what's going on. And we'll take a look real quick at some places around Arizona. So this is Governor Hunt wearing his mask with a colleague. And there are very few images that I could find for this exhibit specific to Arizona that pertain to the flu. And this was one of them. In Arizona, 6,000 people died due to the flu. Here's another image that came up, and this is a street scene in Jerome. And if you look closely, you can see, there are masked figures in the street here. So there was a masking order in place in Jerome. At one point in mid-October, just for example of what was going on, 125 people had been stricken with the flu, and of those, 21 died. And of those 21, all of them were between the ages of 25 and 32. Like other communities, they experienced trouble keeping up in mortuaries. But compared to a lot of other towns, they did actually pretty well handling the crisis because they acted quickly. This is Fort Whipple near Prescott, and I just wanted to talk about this for a minute because it's a perfect example. It kind of illustrates how military bases contributed to the spread of the flu. So you had a couple of soldiers arrive from Iowa who were sick. They came to Fort Whipple for training, and within 2 days there were 13 cases of the flu at the fort. So they went into quarantine, but the disease had already spread into Prescott. And so you would see also different communities experiencing peaks at different times. So here on the right, it says flu nearly stamped out at Fort Whipple. Things are improving there, but here on the same day in Prescott, we're still reporting on people who are dying. By early December, northern Arizona towns like Flagstaff and Holbrook and Winslow are experiencing a decline, but on that very same day, the quarantine's lifted at Fort Whipple, but then we have this really tragic story in the Prescott paper about a couple who have just died. There's been a double funeral. They died within a few days of each other, and they left behind 2 children. So children being orphaned, that was a common part of this whole experience. And this is a headline from New York, and it's from November 8th, and it says the health commissioner is estimating at that point in the pandemic that there are about 21,000 children in the city who have lost either one or both parents. Mining towns experienced a kind of special problem because there were crowded and impoverished living conditions. So the cases tended to be really high in towns like Bisbee and Globe. They had to do things like other communities, turn to converting schools into emergency hospitals. But also you had examples of people looking out for each other where the healthcare system and the resources in place weren't quite enough. You also had neighbors looking out for each other. So for example, there's a story of one woman in Bisbee, even though she was pregnant, at the time she went out among the miners in Bisbee cooking food and helping the ones that had lost their children and their wives. And that was especially brave. It was brave enough to expose yourself, but especially brave if you were pregnant. Your risk of death if you got the flu was really, really high. So as we see with places around the state, you had individuals tackling the pandemic, stepping up to help when the healthcare system is overrun. But the Navajo Reservation is one place I'd like to spend a little time on, because you'll see probably a little bit of a connection to today. And they had some of their own challenges to face. And this, before I get to that, is a chart that was printed in the newspaper, kind of outlining the cases county by county throughout Arizona. And you can see that in the counties that have the mining towns like Cochise and Gila, the cases are really, really high. Okay. So during this time and directly following the pandemic, there was limited information about what really, what the statistics were. They were underreported statistics on the Indian reservations, and particularly on the Navajo reservation. But there is a report that was published in 1921 by a man named Albert Regan, and it appeared in a science journal, and it offers a first-hand account of what the flu was like on the reservation. So he was sent out from Washington, D.C. to go take charge of a boarding school. And he talks about how on his travels across the country, he's reading all the headlines from the different cities that he's going through about the flu. And it's, at the height, things are at a crisis point at a lot of cities across the country. And he makes his way to Arizona. He arrives in Flagstaff. Here's news that the school, the college, is in quarantine. One of the professors has actually died. He loads up into a car with other colleagues to get to the boarding school, and one of the colleagues falls gravely ill. And with all that information, knowing what he knew and what the situation was across the country, nobody in that car realized that the man they were with had the flu. They just weren't quite connecting the dots that it was actually here and right next to them. So when he arrives on the reservation, he's quickly put to work helping out at another boarding school, lots of children, really, really sick. One of the things about this flu is it often caused delirium, with the high fever. And so you had a lot of children who were very ill, and those who were caring for them who were also very ill, trying to take care of them. So he and his wife assisted a physician all throughout wherever they were called to help out on the reservation. They helped out in a Hopi village where more than half of the residents were sick. Some families were subsisting on half a melon for the better part of a week. They were so weakened by the flu. So in the end, he kind of wraps up with other accounts of what happened. Whole families would be wiped out by this disease. And, a lot of the families lived separated and remote, and you might think that might work to your advantage as far as avoiding getting sick, social distancing. But what tended to happen is that you had these families, they got sick anyway, and they would be out herding sheep or gathering food, and everybody got sick at the same time. So there was no one to take care of each other. And so you even had children orphaned again, off alone. So the mortality rate worldwide in general for the flu was right about 2.5%. Scholars, after going back and taking a look at what information they can go through, figured that the mortality rate on the Navajo reservation was between 10 and 12%. So very, very high. And as we've seen with COVID, it's, that community has been hit pretty hard again. So by looking at what happened on the Navajo reservation, we can see the degree of suffering that was possible. And their experience is an example of how difficult it could be to restore health and wholeness to a community. And in other places, the interest in preserving community health ended up raising questions about civil liberties and economic well-being. And so now I want to talk about a little bit about what happened in Tucson. There was an interesting historical journal article about how Tucson handled the pandemic. And their situation here shows an interesting relationship between public health officials, businesses, the press, the law. And I think some of these things will sound familiar. On October 10th, 1918, Tucson had about 27 cases of the flu. And the state superintendent of health, Dr. Brown, advised Tucson's health officer, Dr. Klein, by telegram to close all places of public gathering, to have doctors start reporting flu cases, and to put strict quarantine measures in place. And that same day, the mayor of Tucson went ahead and put those orders in place, and people were, schools were closed, churches and theaters were closed, police were sent out to disperse crowds on the street. Tourist attractions, libraries, all of that were closed. Classes at the University of Arizona suspended, but the cases still rose. And a week later, just by example, to give you an idea, the university itself had 120 flu cases, and they needed to open up a temporary hospital on campus, and they turned their gymnasium into a hospital for students because all the other facilities in town were full. And so at the outset of these closures, these quarantine measures, you had some very vocal opponents, and those were the businesses. And after a few weeks of closures, the Tucson Star, one of the newspapers, suggested that maybe Tucson could explore having a mask ordinance, and that would allow businesses to open up. And so by mid-November, the city did, in fact, enact a mask mandate that required everyone to wear a mask covering the nose and mouth while in public, and that people could go out for transactional business. Businesses had to allow 500 square foot of space per customer. And violators could face a fine of $10 or imprisonment for up to 30 days if they weren't wearing their mask. So Red Cross volunteers mobilized, and within 24 hours, they had 2,300 masks. And the mayor even went so far as to appoint ununiformed officers to help enforce the mandate. So things progress. It's December, early December, and the local health board decides that maybe they can lift the quarantine, but we need to keep people wearing masks. So people were able to go out to theaters and congregate and do all the normal things, but they were supposed to be wearing masks. Well, people became lax. The city revised the mandate to kind of beef up enforcement in mid-December. And the Tucson Citizen had this to say about the masking mandate. He says, "We never thought much of the masking business, but the people have delegated to certain authorities the power to make regulations on these matters, and if they order us to mask, the only thing to do is submit gracefully. The fellow who does not believe in the mask should be willing to wear it for the peace of mind of the fellow who does." So here you have the press weighing in, kind of, helping to shape public opinion. Later, the mandate was challenged in court, but some cases were prosecuted. Some people were actually found guilty of being in violation of the mask ordinance, and some of their excuses are, one man said he'd had a recent operation on his nose, so it was uncomfortable to wear the mask. And one man was a window washer and said he needed to be able to blow on the glass. That's why he wasn't wearing his mask. And one man said he'd just thrown out his cigar and was going to put his mask back on, but that's why he wasn't wearing the mask. But eventually, the ordinance went away by the end of December. Cases had declined enough, and they figured it was okay. So Tucson's an interesting study, and so is Phoenix. I might hit a slide. There we go. And Phoenix is actually a town that other towns in Arizona pointed to and kind of said, thank goodness we're not Phoenix. Thank goodness we're not doing it the way they're doing things in Phoenix. So Phoenix is an interesting comparison to Tucson because they were actually pretty similar in size at the time. Phoenix had 28,000 residents, so it's just slightly larger than Tucson. And, out west, they had time to see that the flu was coming. They could see the reports back east. Everybody understood that it was working its way west. But local public health officials kind of thought maybe Phoenix could skate. The climate and the dry air was seen as therapeutic. Phoenix advertised itself as a health haven. It's a place you went to improve your health. People suffering from tuberculosis came out here, and I imagine that was the case in Tucson as well. But when that second wave arrived in late September, the Phoenix newspapers were not talking about it. They were kind of keeping it quiet. But by early October, the public gatherings in Phoenix were banned, so they did much of the same things that Tucson did. Football games were postponed, the state fair was postponed. They even went so far as to put up roadblocks on the way into town to limit travel, to limit who could come into town. They even encouraged mail order shopping, and they would put placards in front of homes where people were infected. So no real privacy, and that happened, I think, in other cities across the country. Patients filled up the hospitals. The main hospitals were St. Joseph and Good Samaritan. And even those were filled to capacity, and it was necessary to convert the women's club into a temporary hospital. And when that overflowed, they were setting up temporary hospitals in an adjacent lot, a couple of tents with 40 beds. So again, they were overwhelmed. One woman named Edna Brazil, who was a Phoenix resident at the time, remembered as many as 22 caskets stacked up one on top of the other in the mortuary where her fiance worked at the time. So that's the situation in Phoenix, and it's not really until early November that you see the paper publicly acknowledging that there is a crisis. And so you can see this is an article, plague increases in city, 73 new cases, 4 deaths in one day, Red Cross appeal. And so this is an appeal for volunteers to help out with the Red Cross. And the closing line says, fearless men and women only, cowards not wanted. So interestingly, we have the paper, November 8th, saying, okay, crisis, we're in a bad place, yet just around the corner, you have Armistice Day. And what happens? A big impromptu mile-long parade through the streets of Phoenix, right in the midst of the worst stage of the pandemic. And in fact, cases spiked the following week to 1,688 deaths. So by the end of November, Phoenix was ready to put in a mask mandate. They're probably about 10 days behind Tucson on this. And an interesting footnote about enforcement in Phoenix for wearing masks is, and mandates, was they had something called a Phoenix Citizens Committee, and it was a deputized special police force that went around making sure that people were wearing masks, arresting anyone who spit or anyone who coughed without covering their mouth. And these citizen committees were not uncommon, and a lot of them came into being during the First World War. And they were a group that would go and encourage people to buy liberty or to buy war bonds for the war effort. But they often used intimidation tactics. I mean, they were not a group you wanted to mess around with. The Phoenix Citizens Committee went so far as to hang someone in effigy who wasn't buying a bond. So they were kind of a scary group. And interesting, this same group that was enforcing, the mask mandates and so forth, early in the pandemic, they were actually going around ordering businesses not to mention the epidemic directly or indirectly in their advertising in late September and early October. So you have enforcement and reaction kind of all over the place in Phoenix. And so when cases seem to be getting better, the businesses wanted to take advantage of the holiday shopping season. So Phoenix opened up completely. Mask mandate went aside, businesses full capacity. They just opened up all at once. And again, Phoenix experienced another spike in January. And it was one of the few cities in the country that had to shut down twice because the cases had gotten out of hand. And we even see evidence that as far as into March of the following year, Phoenix was still struggling with flu cases. There is a Buckeye newspaper on March 20th, 1919, that had this to say: "We state on the very best authority that the flu is now and has been for several weeks raging in Phoenix. Indeed, we are informed that it is as bad or worse than it has ever been, and many deaths every week are resulting from this epidemic. It strikes us that a newspaper is not fulfilling its duty to the public when it refrains from telling the facts about such things, for fear it will keep someone from coming to town and spending 10 cents for a nickel's worth of peanuts." So, the Buckeye newspaper is calling out the press in Phoenix. So with Phoenix, we see a real contradictory messaging, kind of this real sway over leadership over how public health messaging gets out, how information is communicated. And so I wanted to spend, a little time setting the stage with Phoenix as we get closer to Litchfield Park, since they were so close. So Litchfield Park, being 20 miles outside of Phoenix, was just getting up and running. And I would say that while many communities during the flu pandemic, they made temporary changes. They converted existing infrastructure for emergency use, like we have the Women's Club building in Phoenix and schools and so forth being used as hospitals. I would argue that maybe in Litchfield Park that the flu may have accelerated the creation of infrastructure. And so we can point to a few things in existence here because of that pandemic. So first I want to paint a picture for you to give an idea of what Litchfield Park looked like. This is circa 1918. Housing's pretty rudimentary, pretty small for laborers there. We even have canvas flapped, cabins here. But the structures are pretty small, 10 by 12 foot buildings, some were 14 by 20. The first crop, the cotton crop, produced by Southwest Cotton Company out here, was ready by the fall of 1917, so things were up and rolling. It had taken 2,500 men to clear the land, so we know there was plenty of people about to do the labor. The school population was growing. They were up to about 175 students. And we also know that at this point, in 1918, that Paul Litchfield had already brought laborers from Mexico to the area. So again, it was a very busy place. Southwest Cotton Company was also bringing electricity, digging wells, improving irrigation, laying out the town, the water mains, all those things were taking place. They'd even built the business block, which had burned down and been rebuilt, all in that area, that time of 1918. If I missed. We were pretty isolated from Phoenix. It was just 20 miles away, but travel was a different story back then. No paved roads, so travel was pretty tedious and bumpy and dusty. Add to that we had the Agua Fria River separating us from Phoenix, so people preferred to take a route that had a bridge. And there was one preferred route, and that was Buckeye Road. And as it turns out, in the fall of 1918, the bridge washed out. So you have an isolated community. Travel would have been tedious even if the bridge had been in place. And here I'll just show you, it's kind of cut off. This is the railroad bridge here in the middle. This is the highway, the traffic bridge that was built later, and this is the one that would have washed out. So you have that situation with travel. Add to that, even if you could get to Phoenix, you knew that the hospitals were overflowing. Add to that, there may be a roadblock, and maybe they won't let you into Phoenix. So I suspect that all of these circumstances really propelled Southwest Cotton Company to act quickly and come up with a way to deal with people who were getting sick. So when the pandemic hit, the need for services was abundantly clear, and they initially set up an emergency hospital, and the approximate location was the northeast corner of the business block. So here it is today. So a temporary building was put up. They brought out a doctor from Maine, Dr. Francis Brown, and he was employed by the company to take charge. And one of the things we know about the flu is that just having good care, having someone look after you, feed you, make sure you've got proper shelter, that improves your chances of recovering. Contrasting that to what happened on the Navajo reservation and other poor places where people didn't have anyone to look after them or any kind of resources to help them. So we can be fairly certain that his presence here and his staff did a lot to save lives. And even though we had this temporary emergency hospital, a permanent site was quickly selected, and they located it a couple blocks north of the business section, and they began a building, and they completed it in 1919, and this is what it looked like. And this is facing west. The front of the building faced west. Here was the original emergency location, and those of you that are sitting here right now might recognize where this is. So here's the church that we're at, and the footprint of that hospital is roughly in this area. We are right here in Sowers Hall. And here's another photo kind of giving you a sense of where the hospital is located. So here's the church after it was built, and then there's the hospital. So today, the westernmost portion of the church at Litchfield Park here, that property partially overlaps the former foundation of the hospital, which faced west. And so I put this together. You can find aerial photos over time of the area. And so here, I've kind of overlapped an older photo with a current one. And as best as I can estimate, it was approximately there. And we are sitting here together in Sowers Hall right here. So just down the hallway. We're just mere steps away from where that hospital would have been. So given what we know, that hospital must have been a huge asset to the community, and it served the community until 1932. And by then, there was little need to maintain the hospital because transportation had improved to where it was not a hardship to just drive yourself or get to Phoenix. It was not as difficult. After 1932, the building was later used as an annex for the wigwam, and then it was later torn down, and I believe the year is 1986. So there you have it, no longer standing, but it was here in our community, and it's just feet away from where we are right now. Another legacy locally is the original elementary school that was built, and this is what it looked like. They chose to build 4 separate classrooms, and they were influenced to do that by the fact that the flu was in the community, and it was an attempt to reduce contagion among students, to kind of keep students more separate, rather than choose to build a single school building They chose to space them out. And the buildings were begun in 1919. And it took some time, but those decisions were made in the wake of the flu. And let's see. We have the Goodyear Farms Historic Cemetery also, many people are aware of, and that is certainly something that a lot of people know exists today. So it's located near, if you're not familiar, near Santa Fe Trail and Indian School Road, and it's our most visible legacy. So here we have Dysart, here we have Indian School, and just past the Albertson Shopping Center, and right here, behind these buildings, behind these businesses here, is the historic cemetery. Now, it was established in 1917, but there are many, many victims of the flu who are buried there. And it served an important function in the community for many years. For a period of time, it was not well cared for over the years, but, and there are actually some other historic cemeteries that serve Mexican communities in the Phoenix area that also are facing a similar situation. But fortunately today, the city of Avondale looks after the cemetery. It's been looked after. Ballet Folklorico Esperanza does a lot to keep it clean. And it's kind of enjoyed a kind of rebirth. And today, it's kind of a center of cultural identity and celebration and remembrance. And so that's one of our local legacies here. So to kind of bring this all together, there's, we can see a lot of parallels to today. There's a lot of things that happened 100 years ago that are not new. And again, we have tangible reminders around us. The flu has been historically kind of forgotten in some ways. Again, renewed interest because of COVID. But we also have gaps in our historical record. And what we don't have a lot of are personal accounts. When I would look for things, it was often no more than a sentence or two, kind of embedded in a larger oral history. There wasn't a lot of talking about this pandemic when it passed. It was kind of overshadowed by World War I. It was probably easier to memorialize people who participated in the war than it was to, look back and remember, probably a certain degree of trauma that came out of experiencing the flu. And today, I think it's a little different with COVID. I do think we're going to emerge with a healthier chronicle of what's happened, and details and stats and personal accounts, and a narrative and a timeline of how it unfolded, and we'll have it all archived and people can study it. But I would argue there's something special about having a primary source in your hand that breathes life into an event, something direct from someone who experienced an event. And one example, I guess I was going to include a slide, but I did not. When we had our presenter in November on the POW camps, I went looking through our files knowing that there were POW camps located close to Litchfield Park. And in our files, there's an actual report from a farmer in Buckeye that had every POW's name and how many pounds of cotton they picked. So you had an actual document, recording, their labor. And there was even a letter sent by a former POW to the farmer in Buckeye whose cotton he picked. And, it just makes things more real and kind of creates a stronger link with the past. And these are things that could have been thrown away. Sometimes, just little bits of information can be really powerful. So, I'd like to make a pitch, and actually, there we go. At the Historical Society, we've created a web page for collecting our local COVID history. I think we all recognize now it's altered our world, at least for the time being. And like the 1918 pandemic, there may be some lasting changes in society that we don't yet know about. And at this point in time, I think we've all been affected in some way, whether we ourselves or someone we know has contracted the disease, or whether it's just simply that it's changed how we live our daily lives. And I'm willing to bet we all have thoughts and feelings about this event. And I think those details are significant, no matter how mundane they might seem at first glance. So I would like to encourage you to take some time to reflect and share, and visit our website. And so we have this COVID memory page. We have prompts if you go there, if you're not sure what to write, if you want to write something. It can be a full essay, it can be a paragraph, it can be a sentence or two, just an observation. But we have different things to kind of spark ideas so that you can share something. We'll also take photos as well. And we'll also take physical objects. So if there are any physical, artifacts that are emblematic of this time that you want to share with us, you can contact the museum. So I would say hold on to those things, reflect on this time, keep track of it, and share it. Thanks. All right. Do we have any questions out there? Or any questions on Zoom? No? Oh, yes.
When did it end and how?
So the question is, when did it end and how? The worst of it ended the summer of 1919. It was kind of a gradual, kind of burning itself out. And you had it mutating, so sometimes it was really severe, but it was still around, and not as severe, but it technically, it was still there, but it was not as devastating. And so it may have gone on as long as 1920 in some parts of the world. But it just kind of gradually worked its way through. And again, I think as it mutated, sometimes it was a less severe form, but it was still around. Any other questions? Yes?
In looking at the Navajo Nation, did anyone study to try to decide, were they harder hit because of their DNA, or was it a lifestyle situation?
Okay, so the question is about the Navajo reservation, whether it was their circumstances or DNA. It really, from what I've read, it really had a lot to do with culture and where they lived and being remote and not having enough resources. Yeah. So again, you had everybody, going out among, scattering through the reservation trying to help people, and even traditional healers looking after each other and people in their community. But what they really think it came down to, is it wasn't genetic, it was, being remote and being vulnerable because you were so far away from other people who could take care of you and help you. Yes?
You said the media couldn't be trusted back then, the newspapers weren't being accurate, even reporting or underreporting. So who could you trust for being correct in giving information to the public?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, media seemed to be a little bit difficult to trust back then. Who could you trust? I don't really know. I think people were gleaning what they could. There was information in the papers at some point, and you were getting instructions from health officials, but it wasn't always the most coordinated, and every town kind of did it their own way. There was not a big coordinated effort, so yeah, I don't know, you know. Probably individuals that you trusted, you know, that for information, and yeah, maybe the local health officials, I don't know. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming today. Oh, do we have a question?
Yeah, can you give some ideas for reading material for those who would like to study this further?
Yes. So there are, well, the book that I referred to quite a bit was called The Great Influenza by John M. Barry. And there are a few other good books out there. What I can do is I can put together a list and email it to those who are interested, or if they want to send an email to the museum. But anybody who joined us by Zoom, I could easily just send that out. So I'd be happy to do that, to share a reading list. Okay. All right. Well, thank you again.